Hi, this is Miss Litton, and our Trent is absent today. So Trent, say hi to Trent.
Hi, Trent.
This is for you. We know you're not feeling good. So this is chapter 15, Darwin and evolution. We are going to talk today about a little bit about the history. Darwin wasn't the first one to think about evolution, and we want to look at some of the background behind that. And then we're going to also be looking at different pieces of evidence of evolution as well. Today, based on what I saw in some of the essays, we are going to reinstate the debrief because I believe it is a necessary part of your learning. And I'm going to change it up just a little bit this time and give it a different twist. We're going to debrief per chapter. So today I'll talk to you about what I expect in the debrief for chapter 15, and we'll get some of it done today, and possibly then you'll work on some of it next time as well. And that way, when you walk away, you for sure have the big ticket items in your head and some evidence where you had to synthesize that and write it down. So I'll go over that with you today as well. So for instance, this is a whale. What would you classify a whale as? A mammal, all right. So now this whale, it has fins. And why would you say it needs fins? Because it does what? It swims, right? Are there other organisms in the water that swim that have fins? Yes. But are they necessarily all related to the mammal whale here? No. Okay. So we're going to need to make sure we can distinguish between things that are a result of what's called convergent evolution. So convergent, if you are converging on a point, are you coming from the same place? Are you ending up at the same place? Yeah. So there's how you're dealing with your environment, which is using a fin to get through water, but it doesn't mean that you have a common ancestor. Just like not all things that fly are related, right? If you've got a bird, a bee, and a bat, who's related? Bird, a bee, and a bat. Who's related? Birds and the bats are more closely related. But all three of them have wings and deal with their environment in the same way. That would be convergent evolution. We're going to look at some other things as well. When you look at the whale, it has a residual hip bone and part of a femur. Now, what does that tell you? It walked at one point. But somehow it must have been more adaptive for it to move its home into the what? Water. We're going to look at the history of that because you're thinking, when we talk about special creation, and at the time when ideas of evolution were coming about, and again, I am mocking no faith when I explain this. I am a woman of faith, so I'm not mocking anyone's faith. But I want you to understand at the time, what scientists would say at the time is that God created that whale to have that hip bone and part of a femur. And my question would be, what? Why? Why? Okay, but there was an idea of fixity of species. So if a salamander who lived in a cave had these vestigial eyes, and this would be a vestigial kind of hind limb, these withered eyes, what at the time would be said is, well, you know, God made him with those withered eyes. Whereas what Darwin might say is what? What could Darwin say? Tell your bio buddy. Why does the salamander have withered eyes? So Darwin would say that that salamander didn't always live in the cave, right? What would he say? That he moved into the cave. Were eyes important in the cave? No. Why? Dark. He needed to exploit other things, right, in order to survive. So that did not, his survival and reproduction was not dependent upon having eyes. It did not increase his fitness in any way. So those became less important. So if he had a withered eye or a blind eye or whatever, it didn't make any difference. As long as you had vast amounts of what? Time. Yeah, time. Okay, so we're going to go through all of those. What is evolution? How did that thought come about? And then now what are currently some pieces of evidence? So we will talk about Charles Darwin, but we'll also look at his contemporaries before him. He was not the first one to think about evolution. He did not coin the phrase survival of the fittest. a man named Wallace did, who was trying to survive malaria, and he thought he was going to what? Die. Okay, so, but he's the one who gave the mechanism for evolution, for change over time that worked. And that mechanism was natural selection. He didn't have even all the pieces of that puzzle. And the reason is because there was not a working understanding of genetics at that time. Remember, who was a contemporary of his who did do genetics experiments? Mendel. But he wasn't reading any of Mendel's work. Remember, Mendel passed away before any of his work was published, so he didn't have access to that. So, for instance, Darwin could not explain why there were variation among young. Like if giraffes were having babies, some of their babies would grow up to be taller than them, some of their babies would grow up to be about the same size, and some would grow up to be shorter. He could not explain that process. So there were still gaps in his learning, but his ideas still made sense. Just like Mendel didn't understand meiosis, he didn't understand the steps of independent assortment and how chromosomes line up during metaphase 1, but he could still look at the data and predict what was going on at the time, even though he couldn't actually what? See it with his eyes. Okay? So we'll look at that. So the thing about Darwin is he took this voyage. Now, also about Darwin is he was going to go to med school. That was his thing. He was going to be a doctor. So there's some learning and understanding about anatomy and functions. But he couldn't stomach what you had to do to be a doctor. And then he decided he would be a clergyman. And clergy, then he had a working understanding of what the religious point of view about organisms and where they came from. He had a good working understanding of that. But he loved science and he wanted to be a naturalist, so he signed up, hey, I'm going to join this boat and the HMS Beagle for this 5-year trip, and I'm going to go on this tour. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the books he was reading at the time. Some of his observations, and sorry, these ones I couldn't fix because they were like pull-out tabs, so these are going to be a little bit crooked. So one of the places is, if we're looking right here at South America, on the east coast here, as far as our point of view goes, of South America, this right here, if you saw that, you would think it's like an ostrich, right? It looks like an ostrich. But this is called a rhea, but yet it looks like an African ostrich. So there are a lot of similarities between those two organisms, but yet there are differences. He went, if we go here, see, like on the southern part of South America, you've heard of Patagonia. Yes?
So with the rhea, is that sort of that's sort of the same thing as like tectonic plate shifting? Because
yes, that's where this is what I'm going over now is some of his like big ticket observations that framed his thinking at the time. So when he was looking at these Patagonian deserts and the sparseness of them, he looked at what organisms were able to survive and reproduce were different than, let's say, if you're in a rainforest, which is what he was when he was on the western side of South America. And he was like, look at the organisms, the plants and the animals, right? You're going to find those broadleaf, jungly type trees on the western side, and you're going to find at the tip of South America where it was more desert-like, you're going to see smaller leaves and things like that. And he's like, did God just make them there and they're good for that climate, or did they evolve there in those conditions and the ones that were best fit survived? Now, he didn't know all that then, but these were the things rolling around in his head. He looked at things like mountains with strata where there are fossils in them, things that were their shells in mountains. Well, what does that tell you about that area if there are seashells in the middle of a mountain? Right. And that's what we would call geologic evolution. So you're saying, did God go, and I'm not trying to be a little God in any way when I say this, did you just like make those appear? Like, I'm going to put seashells in this mountain to confuse man, you know? Or is it possible that that area could have been covered with water, and so clams and things would survive in that area? That is geologic evolution. And if geology can change over time, right? If land formations can change over time, why couldn't organisms change over time as well? So this is what he's thinking about. Okay, he looked at endemic species. Like on the Galapagos Island, you have these iguanas. Nowhere else do they go swimming in ocean water. Nowhere else. Nowhere else do they eat algae off the rocks. Was it that God said, I'm just going to make this one species here and nowhere else, you know, and because I have a lot of time on my hands? Or is it possible that this was a modification from an organism that lived on the mainland, and that somehow they got here and then they were adapting to their current environment, and in their current environment, that was what the food that they had to eat? And then you look at this like hyper specialization with Darwin's finches, right? And you can look at islands where there is low competition. You don't have as many species, right? Distinctions. But where there is high competition, then you get more of these species trying to exploit a different niche so that they have the resources to stay alive. Okay? So he's on his journey. These are the things that he's thinking about. But I want you to know the history of what came before him that's churning around in his head as well. So I'm going to go through some other scientists that came before him, one of which is his grandfather, who was one of the first ones to say descent with modification. He just couldn't come up with a mechanism to explain it. And his name was Erasmus Darwin. Okay, let's look at our notes for just a minute. So on Darwin's trip, I gave you 1, I gave you 2, I gave you 3. Number 4, his viewpoint began changing throughout the voyage. Several other scientists influenced him before, during, and after his journey. So now we're on these several other scientists part. Before I start this next part, can you go into Hello Smart and walk out that door? That way when we do get to questions over this, you'll be ready to go. Okay, now, as we go over these, I am going to have you learn their names, but do you see how some is small print, right? So some of them are still significant because they relate to other things we talk about. The small print one is there just for support, like what I've told you before. So the first one I want to talk to you about is Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus is important because when we talk about phylogeny and taxonomy, he's the one who came up with the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species classification, and specifically binomial nomenclature. What do you hear in, what number is bi? 2. So binom, nom means name, to name, like we are Homo sapiens, okay? So he's the one who came up with that. And he was classifying primarily plants, and then this is a painting of him, and then I went and found one of his books, and a picture of that, and I have that on here so you can see kind of some of the things they were doing. So like other taxonomists at his time, though, he believed in special creation. Now, later that changed. He didn't commit to it per se. There are some journals and things like that that note that, but he believed fixity of species, that God created every species wherever it is. Now, he also believed in scala naturae, which means there's this natural order, simple things. And who do you think gets put at the top? Yeah, humans, man. Like we're the apex of all creation, man. So he bought into that centrifugation of we are the creature, which also then gives us permission to do what? Whatever we want, wherever we want to do it, because we're at the top. Okay, so that is Linnaeus. Then next we have Leclerc, or he was called Count Buffon. I always remember his name, Leclerc, because you would have to be a very good clerk to record everything, because he wrote how many volumes of History of All Plants and Animals? 44 volume history. 44 volumes. These are books that were published of all the plants and animals known at the time that he could find. Okay? So he did wonder about descent with modification, because he's looking at all the plants and animals, and he's also looking at where they're living, and they're going, how could the environment have influenced that, right? Where do you find penguins primarily? Where it is what? Cold. Except for the penguins that are on the Galapagos Islands, and those are not large penguins, those are Small. And we think of surface area to volume, right? Remember we've talked about that before? So they're smaller there because it's warmer there. He looked at migration patterns, how one organism could get from one place to another, and could that influence. If you don't have the opportunity to move, then you're not ever going to get there. Name something that is endemic to Australia. Kangaroos, koala bears, right? Australia is an island. Those are marsupials. Okay, you put a marsupial up against a placental, guess who will win every single time? Placental, every single time. A marsupial mammal has to climb out of the reproductive tract and climb up and into a pouch or a fold of some sort, okay? And then it has to attach to a nipple in order to stay alive, okay? That means you have not fully, and to keep developing, you haven't fully developed yet, but you've got to crawl out and find yourself a nipple. No nipple, no life, okay? We don't do that. We keep organisms in us longer and allow them to develop, and then when they are born, they're good to go. Now, we are unique in that, right? It's not like that for us. We're not like a horse where they give birth and it's like, you better get up and start running, right? Because we don't go like, give birth, walk. No, you don't walk? Okay, we're getting rid of you. In fact, we are really into our large mammalian brain. And we like our large mammalian brain so much, even though we're increasing surface area with all our little crevices and folds. It's so big, we can't even hold it up when we are born. There's like no other mammal that does that, right? We're like born and, you know, everyone's like, watch the head, okay? In fact, we give it room to grow. We have a what on top of our head? Soft spot, right? If a baby was born and it couldn't hold up its head in those other species, guess what they would do? Peace out, right? Did you see the lions chasing us? You got to run. You can't run? Bye-bye. Right? But we are willing to hold their head up, help them nurse, right? Protect their soft spot because we value that brain. They will survive and reproduce. If we stop doing that, right? If a baby couldn't hold its head up and we're like, this one's broken, okay? Do you think over time they would start to be able to? Because the ones that survived and reproduced would be the ones who could support their neck. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you put up a placental against a marsupial, remember monotremes are egg-laying, right? Egg-laying. That's even more difficult because you're even more vulnerable out there, right? We will win. But yet in Australia, we have those organisms like koalas that are still surviving. Why? Because placentals can't migrate there unless you're on a what? Boat. They didn't evolve. There was not that competition for that. Yes?
Isn't natural selection kind of messed up for humans because we can survive like 3 days?
Yes, because, yeah, stupid people stay alive, right? Where in another species they wouldn't, right? And, like, you don't have the ability to feed yourself, we'll ship you some food, okay? So I don't mean that, sorry, in a bad way. I don't know if it could be interpreted in any other way but bad, so I don't know how to fix that one. But hashtag true. Okay, so yeah, we overcome it, right? Because I would freeze out there today if I didn't have a sweater and a jacket. Okay, but maybe that is natural selection because I have a large mammalian brain and I knew how to dress, which apparently the school thinks you don't know because I hear on Parent Square, yeah, they told you how to dress today. Which let me tell you, if you were dressed appropriately, Mr. Buchanan would not have to make that call. Okay? Because, yeah, it's terrifying to me. Okay, so Leclerc saw all of these things like geographic isolation, and the struggle for existence, that's Thomas Malthus, we can talk a little bit about that, but he would not commit to the idea of what? It's right there in the notes. What? Evolution. Okay? All right. Who was the first one we talked about? Okay, Linnaeus, binomial nomenclature, okay, fixity of species. Leclerc, he's seeing a lot of things, he's wondering, but not committing to anything about evolution, okay? Here comes Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, okay? He was actually a physician, that's why Darwin was so disappointing. He was a physician, and he was a naturalist. And he did look and suggest the idea of common descent. He just couldn't explain how it could have happened, how you could have this change over time of an organism. He didn't know how to explain that. He looked at, these are all things we currently look at as evidence of evolution currently. We look at animal developments and similarities in developments or developmental genes like Hox genes. We look at artificial selection. Artificial selection, think dogs, right? Think dogs. There's some like ancestral dog, wolf creature or whatever. Now think about all the species of dogs we have, right? So that's man's doing. Think about even in his time about artificial selection. You were selecting for the best and strongest, fastest racehorses, and those are the ones you were letting breed, right? And they gave birth to fast, strong racehorses. That was man influencing a directional selection to have the fastest horse, or the tallest grain, or the smallest little dog, or the meanest other kind of, I don't know what kind of dog, whatever, right? That was man doing that. You could do that within your lifetime. Think about if you had vast amounts of time. Except most people at that time thought that the earth was very, very young, maybe about 4,000 years old. Okay? So it was thought it was a very, very young earth. And vestigial structures, like the whale hippo. So that was Erasmus Darwin. Okay? And then Cuvier. Now, Cuvier, the way I remember him, he's the founder of paleontology, and that's because if you're going to have like a fossil, it has to be cuveyed with some dirt. Cuvee it up, it's down in the soil. He was the first to look at comparative anatomy because he was comparing fossils, fossil structures, and looking at similarities. But he did not think there was evolution change over time. He called it catastrophism. He would say some great catastrophe came about, wiped out all these species. So I know it looks like it's changed over time, but that's not it. These species were all wiped out by some flood or some other catastrophe. So it looks like change over time, but it's not. So that was his explanation for it. Okay, so let's go to our notes underneath historical viewpoints of evolution. For Linnaeus, this is right, the early 1700s to late 1700s, binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature. Classified all the known plants. He was special creation, fixity with species. Maybe later he changed his mind. You have everything for Leclerc in his 44-volume history. Darwin, Charles' grandfather. Possibility of evolution, just couldn't come up with a mechanism. Cuvier, comparative anatomy for classification. Founded paleontology. He believed in fixity of species. He believed in special creation. The reason, bless you, it looked like change over time because he believed in catastrophism. Catastrophism. So major catastrophe and repopulation. All right, now, the first one to give a mechanism and stick with it, okay, that was Lamarck. And I remember Lamarck because he was off the mark, okay. What Lamarck would say is, yes, there was descent with modification, hashtag truth, okay, and that is called evolution. But his mechanism was way off. His idea was use and disuse, and inheritance of acquired characteristics. When you look at the fossil record, who came up with the first paleontology? Cuvier. When you would look at the fossil record, what you could see clearly the giraffe necks had gotten longer over time. But what Lamarck's mechanism was this. You have a population of giraffes. Throughout their lifetime, in order to reach those tall, tall branches, they would stretch their necks and use their necks and use their necks. So when their babies were born, their necks were born a little bit longer, and they would use their necks. So when their babies were born, they were a little bit longer, and so on and so on and so on. And he said, if you didn't use it, right, like, so for instance, the whales didn't use their legs, so then they were born with smaller legs until they were gone. Okay, so his idea was use and disuse. Now, what would Darwin have said? We'll get to Darwin later, but just to contrast that, discuss with your bio buddy, what would Darwin say about the length of giraffe necks? What was his mechanism, and how would he say that came about? Go ahead, have that discussion. Okay, what's Darwin's mechanism? Natural selection. What do you hear in natural? Nature. So he would say you have a whole population of giraffes, right? Some have what? Some have medium and some have short. Of all the population, because there's variety amongst the population, could Darwin explain why there was variety? No. Who did he need to talk to? Mendel, but he didn't. Okay, he didn't know. Okay, he couldn't explain the variety, but he said there's variety amongst those offspring. Of those offspring, who was best adapted to their environment? Longest necks. Because the longest necks got the most food, so they probably had the most sex, increased their fitness. They're the ones, the longer neck giraffes are the ones that survived and reproduced and had more babies. Okay? And so over time, if that keeps happening, you're going to have a trend line towards what? But it requires vast amounts of time. Okay, so contrast that now, youngest bio buddy with Lamarck. Go ahead, youngest bio buddy, contrast it. Okay, so for Lamarck, first to offer hypothesis of how evolution via adaptation occurred. First to offer hypothesis of how evolution via adaptation occurred. Incorrectly proposed the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. That somehow something you acquire during your lifetime you can pass on to your children. Okay, that an organism could acquire adaptations during its life. Oh, I already said that. Good. Okay. Use and disuse. Slate, could you please explain that? Okay, now let's look at some other contemporaries, okay? So there was a man named Hutton who talked about an old Earth. Hutton's idea got published in Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, and here's a picture of his book, okay? What this was saying is that the Earth was actually very what? Old. Very old. Now, there was a problem with the idea here in part of its proposal because it described uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism, actually, Blue, you can explain what uniformitarianism is right here on the screen. Go ahead. So, Hutton said the Earth is old. Lyell explained that like things changed at a uniform pace. Can you give me an example of something that doesn't occur at a uniform pace that changes the Earth? Earthquake. Give me another one. Eruptions, volcanoes, right? All those things. That can change the Earth very rapidly. But Darwin had Lyell's book on his journey. So remember, he's making all those observations when he's going around and looking at desert places, looking at lush places, looking at organisms that look very similar on different continents, looking at fossils, looking at seashells up on these rocky ledges, and he's reading that the Earth is old. So he's starting to put it all together in his head. Now, also you have Thomas Malthus, and I think do you study Thomas Malthus in one of your history classes a little bit? Yeah. Okay. So this is the idea, and you can think about lifeboat ethics by Hardin as well. And the idea is that if you had a lifeboat, okay, and your ship is sinking, are you going to get everybody on your lifeboat probably? And if you did, what would happen to your lifeboat? That's right. So it would sink. So only a few survive. So this is the idea, though he didn't coin the phrase, Wallace did, survival of the fittest. Okay? That there's going to be competition, there's going to be famine, there's going to be war. And some survive and some don't. And he knows about this as well. All right? And I think I gave you everything on that. Yeah? Do I owe you a word on Hutton? Discuss the idea that the earth is old. All right, now you walked out that door, yes? Today, if you were, and you don't know what kind of puppy it is, you could imagine in your head, but if you were going to name a puppy today, and it was going to be your puppy that you got to take home with you right after school, what would be that puppy's name? What would be that puppy's name? Winnie actually is a really good dog name. I admit to that. All right. Fluffy. Stewart. Okay. I'm going to show you the questions so you can work on them at home. Here's question 1. Write your answer. Pause this video right now. Trent. I mean it, Trent. Pause this video right now. Get a piece of paper and a pen and commit your answers. All right, so there's 1. 2. Just pause if you need to. 3. 4. Here's question 5. And here's question 6. And I'm going to pause this, giving students time to think. Okay, hopefully you committed all those answers. If not, rewind and relook at those again, because we're going to check our answers now. Here we go. Good job on number 1. Tell your bye buddy good job. 100% on that. Binomial nomenclature. Who is that? Linnaeus. Okay, some of you were lost there. Number 3. The first to state that evolution happened, that they became adapted to their organism, the first one was Lamarck. Remember, he was off the mark. Off the mark. Okay? Number 4, physician and naturalist, common descent, Erasmus Darwin. 100% right on that, for those of you that got it. Number 5, paleontology, cuvée with dirt, right? And number 6, HMS Beagle, that was Charles Darwin. Tell your bye buddy, how'd you do on that? Did you do a good job? Is your bye buddy making excuses? Okay. All right, now we're gonna focus on Darwin now. Okay, so focusing on Charles Darwin. Here's a young Darwin and an older Darwin. Okay, big idea here is evolution just means change over time. Think about yourself. Think about yourself in middle school. Have you evolved? Are there traits of you that you think are better now? Okay. Have you learned something? Have you, usually if there's a struggle, you become different, right? Hopefully you are learning better study habits in AP biology due to the struggle, right? Because you have to survive. What worked before when you were in 9th grade or 8th grade may not work now, right? But that will make you a more evolved creature and get you ready for next year as well as when you go away to college. Change over time. If it's biological evolution, these are living organisms changing over time. Geologic evolution is the earth changing over time. That's all evolution means. Now, what were some of the things he looked at? Like we talked about before, those seashells way above from the water said, I bet there was water here once, and that was adaptive to those organisms to be a clam. He looked at biogeography, and we've talked about this a little bit before. Before I talk about it, I want, not it, to go ahead, pass or play, talk about biogeography. Go ahead. Okay, you know, because we've talked about this in broad terms, I believe, how old is the Earth? 4.6 billion years. Perfect. How old is the first cell? 3.6. It goes 4, 3, 2, 1. You'll have something for all of that. I'll teach that to you later, okay? But the oldest cell is in the 3.5, okay, billion years old. Mammals, not in billions, mammals were evolving about 65 million years ago, were mammals, okay? Now, do you know what Pangea is? Yeah, supercontinent, right? So at first they were all together, then you know about plate tectonics and they're spreading. At the time when they were gaining in distance away from each other, when Pangea was broken up and really apart, was about 65 million years ago. So when you look at mammals, that's why mammals are so unique to the continent that they're on, right? When you look at grasslands, grasslands usually support a large grazing animal. What are large grazing animals we see here in the United States? Cows. Okay, cows, horses, import. Okay, what else? Tatonka, you know what that is? Buffalo, right? Large grazing animals. We do not, dances with wolves, we do not see zebras, right? It's not something we see unless you're going by Hearst Castle, okay? You don't see giraffes, right? Those are located on other continents. And the reason why they are not ubiquitous is because the continents were apart and there were huge bodies of water separating. But things like ferns, when they were evolving, all the continents were together. So if you put the continents back together like a puzzle piece, right, and put them all there together, you could see the ferns like across several continents because the continents were together and they could spread, right? So that tells you that organisms will change and adapt to their continent. That's why mammals are so unique. You could also look at some other biogeographical evidence like in Antarctica, there are fossils of salamanders and lizards. Well, you can't imagine them living there now. You can barely imagine a person living there, right? Okay, but what does that tell you about that land? It must have been what? Warm, right? So the organisms that are surviving and reproducing there have changed over time because of the climate in which they lived. So these are some of the observations that he was making. When you look here, whoever explained this one, switch, other bio buddy, talk about this. Go ahead. Okay, these are drawings because this is based off fossils. That's why they're drawings. But this looks an awful lot like an armadillo, and this looks an awful lot like a sloth. So what happened? Did God make different ones at different times, and then made them fossils? How did that come about? Or is it that this could be an ancestor to a sloth, and this could be an ancestor to a... Yes, because he could see that. He could see that in the fossil record, but looking what's in the fossil record and looking what's here and now, it's like there was a discrepancy, but yet there was similarities, so maybe there was change over time. Okay, switch one more time. All right, So, okay, go on your notes. Observations of change over time. We talked about this a little bit already. If given enough time, remember the Hutton idea, old, Lyell book, older Earth species could change over time. Blue, can you do the two pieces of evidence, please? Marine seashells inland and on raised beaches, and bones of extinct organisms that were similar to extant living organisms, looking at similarities. Are you extinct or extant? Extant. You are. You got it. Okay. Biogeographical observations are defined as a study of the geographical distribution of organisms throughout the world. And number 2 on evidence, similar environments seem to produce similar organisms. Similar environments produced similar organisms regardless of location, like large grazing animals, right, when you have grasslands. All right, now, the tortoises. These are interesting, okay, on the Galapagos Islands. So he saw, these are all different things that he saw. He saw these marine fossils. He experienced earthquakes, which created geologic evolution quite rapidly. And he looked at animals on different islands, but they seem to have their own unique variation to the island. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is when you look at this tortoise, this is a giant turtle on Santa Cruz Island, part of the Galapagos Islands. So look at the back shell. Do you see that right there? There's the back shell. Okay, so now let's look at that back shell, right here. Now look at this back shell. So they have a lot of similarities, but their shell is different. Look at this tortoise in the top left-hand corner. What do you see around it? Plants, vegetation low to the ground, right? So for those tortoises, they're just eating down below. But what about this tortoise? Explain this with your bio buddy. Why is this such? Nice shot. So, again, making a point. Did God on one island make the shells like this? And on this island, where there wasn't low vegetation, make them like that? And then on that island, where there was both, make it like this? Or could they have adapted to their particular environment? I don't think the first tortoises on this island had shells that were like that. It probably happened in stages, right? Whoa, changed to a highlighter midway. I just love it when it does that. So maybe some of the tortoises of a certain population of tortoises had a little bit more of a curve to their shell. That was a mutation, a variation at the time. But that variation was selected for because they could eat a little bit more than the other tortoises. They had more food available to them because their necks were more flexible in order to reach that food. And over vast amounts of time, that got selected for again and again. Okay. You look at things that are related but slightly different. Like these are the blue-footed boobies. Okay, that's what they're called. And these are endemic species. You can't find them anywhere else. Why are they here? But yet they look related to mainland organisms. Like this right here, Galapagos penguin. It's very small. Normally penguins are not that small, right? Because they're worried about being freezing, right? So, but they are here. Certain colorations of certain birds, things that are unique to them. That is an endemic species. Did they change a little bit? Like when you look at the iguanas, okay? And these are the only ones who eat algae. Well, guess what? That was the only food. So if you were going to survive and reproduce, you better eat that algae. And you better swim from this rock to that rock because a snake is chasing you. So you better just go swimming and then go over to this other rock. So that's what they needed to survive and reproduce. So this was all evidence. Like it looks like one from the mainland, but it's a little bit different. The finches, right? And so they each, again, where there was more competition, you saw them diverting to a path less traveled, a road less traveled. because you were more likely to survive and reproduce if you were exploiting a slightly alternative food source. And if your beak was bigger, you could handle those larger seeds than the finch that originally landed on that particular island. So your offspring survived and reproduced, and of all of your offspring of that lineage, those with the biggest beaks who could handle those larger seeds are the ones who survived and reproduced. So you're exploiting, and this is an example of adaptive radiation, just like spokes on a wheel radiate out. You radiate out and exploit every aspect of that environment. And then here's an actual picture of Darwin's different finches. And so here is one of the earliest version or printing. What do you call that? What did you say? Addition. That's the word. That's the word I was looking for. Addition. Thank you. I knew there was a word in my mind. The Origin of Species. He was pushed to publish this. Because he knew talking and giving contrary evidence to fixity of species, giving contrary evidence, right? There would be backlash to that. And he didn't want to talk about that. He didn't want to have that out there. He didn't want to expose himself in that way. But there was a man named Wallace, okay? And he's sitting on this for years, like over 20 years. He's sitting on this information. But Wallace was a school teacher. He was a naturalist. He went to the Amazon, right? He went to the Amazon, different continent. And he was looking at organisms there. This is years later, experiencing all the same things that Darwin saw when he went to the Galapagos Island. And he's the one who got malaria. And he's like hoping to survive this. And he had an epiphany while he's trying to survive this about, boy, other organisms must have selection pressures. And the best fit are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. This artificial selection of this disease, right? Who's going to survive? And so he sent Darwin, because Darwin was a known naturalist. He's publishing all of these things of what he's saying. He's just not calling a spade yet. Kind of like don't ask, don't tell, right? He's just not coming out with it. And so he sent this essay to Darwin and said, hey, can you proofread this? What do you think about this? The survival of the fittest? And Darwin's like, ugh. I've been thinking about this for years and years and years. I just didn't want to say anything. So they ended up, he's like, this is a great essay. Good job. Publish it. They ended up joint publishing an essay, but Darwin had so many years of evidence that he had thought about this over time. He's really the one credited for coming up with it. He just didn't actually publish the paper to show that. Okay? And Wallace, not it. Go ahead, pass or play. Right? So you don't have like the same organisms all in this place, and the reason is there's a barrier. It's either a mountain barrier, a water barrier, something that's preventing you from moving from one place to another. So you're going to go down your evolutionary line, right? In Australia, there hasn't been the issue where there's been any placental that competes with them. If there are flying squirrels, like in both here in the United States, right? I don't think they're in, maybe not here in the United States. I don't know where. Can somebody look up where the native flying squirrels? They're called different things, but there's a placental version and there's a marsupial version. Okay, they look very, very similar because they went through parallel evolution processes exploiting the same environment. Anybody got native flying squirrels? South of Canada?
Southeast Alaska.
Oh, okay. So I wasn't wrong. That makes me happy. But I wasn't confident in that, but good to know. So you have also, it looks just like a flying squirrel. If you had them, I don't think you and I could tell the difference if we saw them soaring through the air. We're like, no, flying squirrel. Okay? They look very similar in Australia, but they are the marsupial version. is because they're exploiting that same version. There are mice that are marsupial mice and placental mice. They look very similar, exploiting their environment, but there's nobody to compete with that because they are kind of cordoned off. So let's write some of this stuff down. Let's go to natural selection and adaptations, or do I need to do, where do I need to start?
Natural selection.
Thank you. Okay. By 1842, Darwin came up with a mechanism of natural selection, however, did not publish until Alfred Wallace in 1958 sent him a similar idea. The idea of natural selections is organisms have heritable variation. What does it mean to have heritable variation? It can be passed down. It's in your DNA. So, for instance, have you ever noticed or known someone like a baby, and because the baby is laying on their back all the time, they get a what on the back of their head? Flat spot. Were they born with that flat spot? No. It's because they can't lift that big, ginormous brain, and so it's like laying there. They can't do anything, right? They just had to lay there. Like, learn eventually they can roll over and lift up their head, and your brain expands. You've got room for expansion because of that soft spot and all that business. But you will get a flat spot, and they'll even wear away some of their hair right there as a result of that flat spot. That is not something they're going to pass on to their offspring. Who would say they would pass it on to their offspring? Lamarck, okay? But they don't pass it on to their offspring because it's not in their DNA to have a flat spot right there, okay? You could be born and your parents would be like, you know, it would be so fun to have a cone head. And so they put this hat on him that created this cone brain, you know, and he's like, yeah, thanks, Mom. Okay, okay? You could do that. He's not going to have children with a cone head. Okay? Because it's not a heritable variation. He experienced it during his lifetime. Okay? So, okay, so I'm going to jump back a little bit and I'll go to that heritable part. So when we look at natural selection, here we've got the flowers and the hummingbird is pollinating. I just love hummingbirds. And hummingbirds have those long beaks. Do you think that bird started out with those big old long beaks? No. Okay? But as they're trying to get at the nectar, the longer the beak, the better the access to the nectar, right? And so over time, you would select for that longer beaks. Some hummingbirds were born with shorter beaks, some with really long beaks, and some same length as their parents. But that was something they inherited in their DNA. There was an overproduction of these hummingbirds. Not all of them are going to survive and be able to reproduce. They are competing for resources. Those, in that struggle for survival, whoever has the best adaptation, those are the ones, the longer beak are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. And so nature is selecting who is going to survive and reproduce. And over time, those beaks are going to get longer and longer. So if you look on there, your first thing, organisms have heritable variation. Essential to natural selection can be helpful or harmful, whatever they have. To be an adaptation, it must be heritable. To call it an adaptation. And this is all based on the premise that there are variations. You need there to be differences amongst the offspring, and you need to have overproduction of the young, and only some are going to survive. That's your Malthus reference, right? And there's going to be a struggle. There's going to be a struggle, and not all are going to survive. And some are going to be faster, and some are going to be slower, right? And a prey is trying to evolve, and they're going to push each other, right, in their evolution. That's called coevolution, when two different species push each other, because the prey is going to try to get faster and stronger to run away, and the predator is going to try to be what? Faster and stronger in order to catch the prey. They push each other. That's coevolution. They're evolving together. And so number 2, organisms compete. Oh, do I owe you D? Okay, Darwin cannot state the cause of variation. No genetics yet. That was published. No genetics yet. Okay, organisms compete for resources. So we applied Malthus's ideas. Overproduction of potential, competition. Organisms differ in reproductive success. When you talk about fitness of an individual, it's not push-ups, mile time, fat level, okay? Fitness is your ability to contribute to the next generation's genes. How much of your DNA is getting passed on. So organisms differ in reproductive success. Differential reproductive success is the ability to have more offspring as a result of acquiring more resources. Fitness is reproductive success of an individual relative to other members of a population. And that over time, you become adapted. And whoever's turn it is, do you know whose turn it is? Not it. There you go. Pass or play. Explain what adaptations are. Go ahead. Do we need to have an adaptation to withstand pressure of compressing our lungs? Is that something that's going to help you survive and reproduce? No. So it won't. It's not going to influence your fitness at all. So that's not something that's going to be selected for, but it is selected for some organisms. You do need a large blood volume for some organisms. That is going to be an adaptation that's beneficial for them, and it will be selected for, and you have the time to select for it. Okay? Whoever explained this page, can the other bio buddy, what's our mascot? Eagles. So other bio buddy, can you please explain some adaptations of the eagle? Go ahead. All right, now you have to be wary of convergent evolution. So birds and bees both have what? Wings, because they are exposed to the same environment. That does not mean that they share a phylogeny. It does not mean that they have a common ancestor. They're just dealing with their environment in the same way. Okay? And then another one you want to look at is what Darwin studied just like his grandfather did, and that is artificial selection. Go ahead, other bio buddy, explain this one. You got it. So selection leads to change over time. You are going to either adapt or what? Die, right? Adapt or die. Those are your options. Okay? So those organisms that have the best adaptations, those are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. So now, remember we talked about that puppy? Is your puppy here? Is there a puppy you would like on this page? Pick your favorite puppy. So this is a result of artificial selection, okay? Then here's some other examples of artificial selection of plants. So all three of these vegetables, Chinese cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi, were all derived from one species right here. But selecting for different aspects of it, and now you have this huge variety. If man can do this artificially, obviously probably nature can do it and has so much more time. We also want to look at here, okay? So now you can see some parallel evolution. Remember those flying squirrels I told you about? I forgot to show this the last class. Are they on here? Yes, right here. They're called flying squirrel if you're a placental mammal. If you're an Australian mammal, it's flying phalanger. Okay? These are phalanges. Yeah, flying fingers. So you can see some similarities. So you look at a wolf versus a Tasmanian wolf. You can see similarities in that. So whoever's turn it is, can you please explain parallel evolution? Go ahead. All right. So now, on your notes, we had organisms become adapted. An adaptation is any evolved trait that helps an organism be more suited to its environment. Convergent evolution is when unrelated organisms living in similar environments display similar characteristics. When unrelated organisms living in similar environments display similar characteristics. Observations of selection. This is relating specifically, I'm going to tell you that there is an expectation you have to look at selection occurring today. So some of these things we're going to talk about now, but I wanted them in one location so when you're studying it on the whole, you have a list of items here you could use as a reference. But artificial selection, humans select which traits are valued. And I said, think dog breeding. We already talked about the common, oh no, actually we didn't talk about part of this. Oh yes, I did. We did talk about number 2. Blue, can you go over it real quick? Okay. Beak depth, variation on birds. We looked at artificial selection, weather influencing which traits help you to survive. Number 4 is industrial melanism. This is going to talk about moth color. We're going to talk about that later, but I just wanted you to have it here in your list. But we will be talking about that. And that is natural selection before your very eyes. And then number 5 is antibiotic resistance. That is referring to like bacteria, right? We've talked about this before. And the plethora of antibiotics that are in our environment, what is it killing off? The weak bacteria. So what is growing in numbers? Yeah, so that's directional selection. That's a form of artificial selection that we have done to ourselves, right? By continuing to put so many antibiotics in our meat and milk and products and in our body, we're selecting for a stronger and stronger bacteria that maybe we don't have anything to resist it, okay? So that closes that section out, and I want to just touch base a little bit on fossil evidence because I want to pass a few fossils around while we're in class today. Normally I would break this video up. This might be a good stopping point. I want you to take a look at the notes that you have, okay? Look at these pictures. This slide is a little jacked up. Each of these represent a different part in your notes. See if you can figure out what picture goes with what evidence that's in your next set of notes. Go ahead. Look at the boxes in your notes. They're right, they're all there. So what's this one right here, do you think? This would be what? Fossils. That's the only one that's not jacked up. What's this one, you think? Yeah, biogeographical. Okay, what's this one? Now, anatomical, this is showing you homologous structures, but we also, under the anatomical heading, besides homologous structures, we talk about vestigial structures and embryological structures and compare those. Okay, what's this one? Biochemical. Do you remember how we talked about, who does cellular respiration? All cells, and we can look at similarities of the coenzymes and electron transport chain. We can look at the universalness of the genetic code, right? DNA, RNA, ATP, similar enzymes. Okay, that's all underneath the biochemical evidence. And what do you think this one is? Developmental. And this is not just structurally like that. I would put that underneath anatomical when you look at, you and I have gills for a little bit during our embryological development. This one is focusing more on the genes and the similarity. And I already taught you this when we did the developmental. Remember that? And we looked at the Hox genes and how it's conserved. and how that DNA is coding for similarities, whether you're a mouse or a person or a bee, that codes for your head region. So that's what that is relating to. Now, if you would like to be a fossil, okay, it's actually quite difficult. Okay, you have to be 10,000 years old, at least, if you want to be a fossil. And you have to somehow not be destroyed by the geologic evolution going around you and the biological evolution going around you. You cannot be eaten, dismembered, okay? You have to be somehow put in a situation where you can actually be preserved, and then, epic, for a fossil, you have to be found by a Homo sapien, right? You have to be found by a person to be a fossil, okay? And it could include anything: skeleton, shells, seeds. It could be a footprint. It could be a wormhole that's left behind. And fossils support the idea of common descent because you can see change over time. Now, as I go through this next part, I'm going to pass some fossils around. All of these belong to me personally, so I'd like you to be careful with them. We're going to go down, across, up, across, down, and I'll pick them up from you there at the end, okay? All right, so these first three, these I'm going to show you were all found on my parents' ranch, which we don't own anymore, okay? And so that makes me sad. So this was in Paso, and so in Paso, that's like 30 miles in from the coast. And I want to talk to you about a mold and a cast. It's a type of fossil. So, you know, like a jello mold, right? Okay, all right. So you could have a clam. It could die, right? It could be covered with dirt. And then the clam itself, the components of the clam deteriorates. Okay, this is a mold of that clam. That mold could be filled in with some other dirt and harden in that shape. That would be a cast. Does that make sense to you? Cast, okay? So that's probably what these are. Be very, very careful with them, okay? So these are probably casts, okay? All of these. And then you just pass them down, and, okay. Now this one's weird, okay? The only reason I would even have a clue what it possibly could be is there were large parts of a whale fossil, whale's fossil remains. And feel your middle finger and feel your digit right here and how it narrows inside and then widens here on the side. They think this is part of the whale phalange, okay? This portion of it. And this would be the joint on either end. It's very heavy. Don't drop it on your Chromebook. Okay? This one, I have some other fossils. This one is a bird bone fossilized in rock. And this was given to me along with some other fossils. I just don't have time to share them all, by a student whose grandfather was a geology professor. And so he gave me several fossils. Okay? Now, these next ones I bought at a store. Okay? This is a trilobite, and it's what's called an index fossil. And some dumb donkey dropped it and broke it right there, and it makes me mad. As well as this one. Here's another smaller version of that. And then this one, also dropped, broken, that I glued back together. But this is like showing you segmentation. So those are some fossils to go around. Now, come back to me. Okay, so listen why passing. Listen why passing. So these fossils, some of the arguments against fossils is that you don't see transitional fossils. Like you have amphibians, who would evolve, or fish. I gave it away. Who would evolve from a fish? Amphibian. Then who could evolve from an amphibian? A reptile. Who could evolve from reptiles? Birds, mammals, right? Birds are given a class, like reptiles a class and birds are a class, but that's a huge mistake. That's because when classification systems were first going on, they're thinking like, these are flying and this is a lizard. They're not related, but they are, okay? And they should not be their own class. You eat a reptile, flying, or, well, it doesn't fly very well, reptile at Thanksgiving. What's its name? Its name is turkey. There are transitional fossils, but remember they're in transition. So like hot water is really useful, cold water is useful, but what's between hot and cold? More. You don't really want to drink it, but it's really not hot enough for you to cook with. You see what I'm saying there? So you're probably not going to see as many numbers, but here are some transitional fossils. Okay, this is a transition between a fish and an amphibian. So this is like a fish that gets on land. There are ones currently, they're called mud skippers, and they can go from one small pond to another using their fins to get to a better pond. Okay, here's another one, Seymoria. He wanted to see more of the earth, so he started, this is in transition. Did you drop it? No. Okay. He wanted to see more, so this is a transition between an amphibian and a reptile. Here's another one, Archaeopteryx. These are usually, you see this one more. Yeah, and this is a transition between a reptile and a bird.
A dinosaur?
Okay, and then here, Therapsids. You're still talking. Therapsids are mammal-like. And so when you look at these are transitional in form. Some are really super obvious, okay? Like the evolutionary history of equus or the horse. Remember those continents were moving, right? So where a horse originated was once a forested area. And so it was better to be small, agile, and scoot around so that other organisms would not eat you. But as the continents are shifting, you're moving from a tropical region to a drier area, and you cannot support a tree. A tree requires a lot of what? Water. So instead of having a forested area, you're transitioning into a grassland. And at a grassland, it would be either better to be really small so they cannot see you moving through the grass and you could be in holes and dig around or whatever. You don't want to be right at the level of the grasses where you can't get away or hide, but you're not that big. So this would push for that directional selection for the horse to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can see those transition forms really easy in the fossil record. So underneath evidence for evolution, your first one, fossil evidence. Fossil is defined as remains and traces of past life or any other direct evidence of a past life, includes bones and footprints. You have to be 10,000 years old. Transitional fossils resemble two groups that are currently classified separately. Oftentimes represent an intermediate of some sort. All right, there's 4 other pieces of evidence that we're going to discuss. But Trent, I also want you to have the debrief. So I want to open that up for you right now. Recent. Do you see it? I see it. So your chapter 15 debrief. Listen to all of it so you get it right first. Okay? One thing I want you to do, I want you to write number 1, chapter 15. The idea of natural selection. I want you to explain overproduction of young, the struggle for existence. I want you to explain how could nature do the choosing. Okay? Part B for chapter 15 that I want you to be able to do is the evidence for evolution. I want you to first name it like you would name fossils. I want you to describe what it is, what that evidence is, and then give an authentic example and how that is evidence for evolution. Like you could use the horse example and explain what is the transition over time. Okay? So that is your debrief. And so I don't imagine this taking more than a page, but make sure it is
Attention
neat.
OPHS students. iClerks will be sold from the pavilion.
Okay, we're so glad you got to see that. Hope you're having a great day. We will continue with the other evidence next time. All right, make good choices.